Games have been changing over recent years, where once players were actually punished for failure, forced to start over, or gradually improve through trial and error, we now see the vast majority adopt increasingly casualized systems, even to the point of instant respawns with no loss and no downside. I won't make this review overly antagonistic, however. I've covered the casualization of games many times before, and needless to say, it's something I am very passionate about. I've been enthralled with various video game worlds for almost 20 years now. Back when I was a child, on weekends, I had 2 hours of limited computer time per day. I had to wash my hands before using the machine, and had to mentally prepare for the session because I knew that if I failed a long siege while playing Stronghold Crusader, or didn't focus on the next boss battle properly, I would not make any progress. Gaming had meaning, and most importantly, a sense of satisfaction and reward. Now, to set the stage properly, I should clarify that such depth is not gone from the modern video game industry, but the once challenging, frustrating, and ultimately fulfilling game structure has been largely replaced with flashy digital casino mechanics, rapid and stimulating loot drops, and an emphasis on fast progression with vibrant special effects and wide-ranging accessibility. There is a place for accessible games, easy games, or games that merely provide a narrative experience without the emphasis on actual player skill development. In fact, games that tap into the larger market of players who prefer to be able to enjoy it with one hand while eating with the other and still win the level, or watch TV while also fighting a boss and somehow end up victorious regardless of their split attention. Games like that can sell far more copies and have a wider potential audience. But casualized games are just not enough for some players. What some perceive as painful frustration, others feel to be an enhancement of prospective rewards and a way to build gratification. Much like modern-day alcohol, games have various different traits. Some partygoers prefer sickly sweet syrupy drinks with soda and sugar to disguise the underlying taste, and they certainly have their place, but others take a shot of pure vodka while deeply inhaling the scent of a raw onion directly after to enhance the flavor. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is the vodka and the onion in a triple shot glass chilled to 0 degrees centigrade. The game is a relic, a representation of broader gaming culture that is not as common as it once was, and as such there are also those who view it to be unacceptable. The idea that Sekiro is too difficult and must add an easy mode in order to respect its players is like saying the bar is too smelly and needs to stop serving vodka and fresh onion in order to respect its customers. Enough intro though, this has all been a roundabout way of saying that the game is difficult and should be embraced for what it is rather than jamming a square peg in a round hole and saying that all players need to have access. This is a FromSoftware game. This is a Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Demon Souls type creation that forms a sense of identity through adversity while offering an experience that players cannot really find anywhere else. And what is the definition of a quality product or service if not providing something that people want and cannot get elsewhere? When it comes to narrative and story, I would not consider myself to be an expert or a dedicated critic on the subject. To me, gameplay rules all. Narrative storytelling with click-based dialogue is often perceived as a nuisance to me, while top-level cinematics and overarching world building is much more important. Sekiro has a very good overarching story, and it has a decent ability to build character attachment, which is something I often don't really feel or relate to in other games. But this comes with a few instances where characters will talk in individual conversations for long periods of time about things that don't really matter to the greater plot, and as a whole, it can be quite annoying. For some players, that will actually be a net positive, but in my personal opinion, the broader story and narrative is excellent, while the more personal conversations at various points often feel hollow and tedious. I greatly respect the game, but for all that respect, there are in truth some areas that seem problematic. The genre is no stranger to choice-based dialogue and outcome-based storytelling, but within Sekiro there is a further element. At various points within the campaign, the player makes choices, but some of those choices hinge on the player having the ability to speak to that character, which is not actually guaranteed because of a punishment system called Dragon Rot. In my first impressions, I had very harsh things to say about Dragon Rot. It felt to me as if the system was at odds with the natural progression of learning through failure or trial and error, and I still feel that way, but having played far more now and understood the system fully, it is less of a painful punishment system and more just tedious. As you die and utilize the resurrection system, a system which by the way feels wonderful and has many times led me to win fights I would have otherwise lost, and in those instances it is satisfying, appreciated, and invaluable. But as you use this powerful system, dragon rot can spread as you die, and if the dragon rot becomes too severe, characters will sicken and even die. Now, personally, I've never had a character die, which I am very thankful for, but it weighed on the back of my mind as I would struggle with certain bosses, and it's not an appreciated system. Also, when you die, half of all coin and half of your current experience bar are lost. The player can easily store money in purses, and sometimes they avoid this effect with unseen aid. Based on Dragon Rot, it's a system that ties together fairly well, but the experience does not carry over to the previously earned skill points, so it's really honestly not that bad, and mostly you will be spending coin as fast as you earn it on emblems, but it did warrant a mention as the second half of the punishment or penalty for death system. The Dragon Rot idea on a basic level makes sense. In truth, it is less of a punishment and more of a replayability tool, or a mechanism to make the world feel fully connected and project a sense of player importance and power. It should also be noted that there are a decent number of consumables which will undo the sickness, but even then, it ended up just being a sort of side effect that I had to keep in the back of my mind but didn't really like or appreciate, and it doesn't really add that much to the game. Another issue is the camera. It's not bad, it is rarely something a player will even notice, but at times, depending on environment and object proximity, the camera gets confused and ends up getting you killed by blocking line of sight or pinning itself against a wall. This is never an issue in wide open areas, but in hallways and tight corridors, the camera can cause some real frustration. So my advice is lure enemies out to wider areas whenever possible, and don't be afraid to skip past them temporarily if it's becoming a serious hang-up. On the subject of skipping past things, the level design is phenomenal. I never really felt forced to go to any one specific place. There were times where I only knew of one more mini-boss or an actual boss to fight against, but after some exploration, there was typically another open window, sunken cavern, or alternative progression method. There were times where the story intersects and a specific boss must be slain or a particular zone finished to advance the overarching narrative, but that is to be expected and it never really felt oppressive in a bad way. It was daunting, but to an understandable degree. One hang-up with progression, however, there are a couple of different times where mechanics repeat in a really strange way. The biggest example is a fight where you think you won, but nope, you baited. You gotta fight the same thing again. And then you think you won again, but nope, you baited a second time. You have to fight the same thing again, and a big fat bonus, you get to fight another one of the same thing at the same time, even though you fought it 2 times already. Like, why? Who designed that? What's the purpose? But in the end, it's actually a very small complaint considering the wonderful enemy design, unique movesets, and very beautiful levels. The mobility in Sekiro is quite high. Rapidly zipping from tree to tree or rooftop to rooftop with the grapple arm is satisfying and fun, but with high mobility comes an emphasis on maneuverability and clearly designed pathways. If you can grapple all over the map, but it never feels clear where you should go, you will constantly get lost and the game will play like shit. Well, Sekiro does not have that problem. I must extend the highest praise to the design team that built a sort of subliminal maze of indicators which seem to generate a natural flow within the game where even when you are panicking and dashing away from an enemy or grappling up to a roof or a tree, you seem to always wind up at the entrance to the next area or back at a sculptor's idol that lets you reorient and progress further. With a lesser crafted world, the frustration would have been rampant, and there are still always those times where the path forward is unclear or unknown and the player is stuck wondering, but it is rare to the point of nearly running unnoticed completely. And oftentimes, the best things about a game are the aspects so well designed and well crafted that you simply don't even think about them. Now though, let's talk about frustration. Sekiro is wildly frustrating at times, but before discussing further, I should clarify something. When I first started, I hated the parry system. It really felt good against basic enemies, but it felt horrible against bosses. It seemed like when I pressed the parry button, it sometimes ignored my inputs and just arbitrarily decided it didn't want to work. And I had viewed that to be shoddy game design, which tainted my opinion of the game. I had also frequently blamed the game for my perceived struggles, which I am fairly certain is not an uncommon thing. Well, turns out no. definitely not. My controller was legitimately broken. Not super broken, mind you, just slightly broken, and the LB button would only press correctly if I applied a certain amount of pressure and specifically held it down towards the middle of the controller. It was really finicky. Because of this, my character would often ignore, air quotes around that, my block commands because they were not in fact being triggered or implemented. Well, I got a new controller and rapidly found that when the block button actually works 100% of the time without having to be jittered in a very specific way, the parry system is actually quite good. I've started to see and hear about speedrunners and more experienced Sekiro veterans using the parry system to quickly defeat bosses by maxing out the posture meter, which makes a lot of sense. But at a less talented level, I found the parry system to be a dance between running, parrying, and attacking, which gave most of the fights very interesting flow and pacing. Because of the controller issues I had for about the first half of the game, I was almost exclusively dodging attacks. I am keeping this review free of any major spoilers, but for any players who know about or end up fighting against it if you haven't already seen it, there is a boss called the Blazing Bull. I fought the bull without firecrackers, only using the dodge button. It was not fun, not at all. I still respected the game, but truthfully at that point, I was pretty unhappy. The dodge mechanic is not very useful in a lot of circumstances. It plays more like a specific counter to a couple of different attacks, which helps tremendously when you use it properly, but it is not like Dark Souls, where your primary defense and tactic is to dodge. Not at all. So any Souls fans should keep that in mind. Perhaps it can be used that way, but it's very difficult to do, and I couldn't make it work. Sekiro also utilizes a system of soft and hard counters. There are often one or two prosthetic tools which greatly impact the overall fight dynamic. For some enemies it's fire, where they outright panic when the fire tool is used. For others it's firecrackers, or the umbrella, or the poison blades, but keep an eye out for all these different upgrades and try them out in different circumstances, because finding the actual counter to a difficult enemy will monumentally change the overall encounter. Even without any counter mechanics or tools, however, progression still occurs, and by progression I mean player skill, and herein lies Sekiro's greatest strength. I am going to play a side-by-side comparison right now between one of the first times I fought a boss and one of the last times I fought that same boss. Like I said, I won't be giving out any major spoilers, but this is a bit of a spoiler, so click away if you don't want to see a bit of that fight. Here it is. The true mastery of this game is the way the player slowly learns the tactics and the techniques and the different movesets, until it all just clicks. You don't consciously notice it necessarily. You don't really have that one moment where it's like, oh yeah, the next try I will do it perfectly. But then somewhere in the back of your mind, it all clicks, and you take the boss down with what seems like ease because you have now mastered the fight. Where once every attack felt unfair and brutal, the inverse now feels true. You know exactly what the enemy will do and can execute a perfectly timed counter to devastating effect. Sekiro isn't for everyone. It builds satisfaction with an emphasis on overcoming adversity, and in today's industry that just isn't common anymore. The game is polished, deliberately crafted, and there is a palpable sense of cosmic design to it. In many games, the players are able to find exploitative measures, or glitch the code, or something like that to that end, but this really isn't something that happens within Sekiro, at least far less than most other contemporary titles. It feels like the development team saw everything coming, and when you advance, it is a combination of your own skill level increasing, your tactics adapting, and, like a puzzle piece sliding into place, discovering what the architects of the game intended all along. The atmosphere, music, cinematics, and graphics all mesh perfectly to round out what should be considered a benchmark in modern gaming. Not a benchmark of difficulty necessarily, but a benchmark of quality and craftsmanship. The game is not perfect, and before anyone comes after me with some poorly articulated elitist comment about how, well, I beat the game like this, and that's just not that hard, and it's a 10 out of 10, and blah fucking blah. No, it's not a 10. And no, most players do not beat this game easily, and pretty much everyone you talk to who talks about how good they are at Sekiro or Dark Souls or whatever else, they probably suck really bad, and spend just as much time as you or anyone else on specific boss fights. But the thing is, that's okay. FromSoftware, the developers behind the game, have a reputation for this. There is a reason why when someone says it's difficult, people often nod and say, oh, like Dark Souls? Well, now Sekiro will be a benchmark. Some people will say it's a really hard game. To the response, oh really, like Sekiro? It will be used as a comparison. IGN gave the game a 9.5. I disagree. Other outlets rated it far lower as a function specifically of the difficulty. Again, I disagree with that too. I would place Sekiro Shadows Die Twice at an 8.5 up to a 9, depending on how well you enjoy the premise of pattern recognition and punishing gameplay. Either way, it's definitely worth playing. Most games nowadays are like 6s or 7s, so Sekiro is a standout regardless of what angle you look from. Then again, I always tend to rate really low. I'm harsh and I look for flaws, but even with that attitude, I can recognize a great game when I see it, and Sekiro is a great game. That will wrap it up for this review though. If you want to support the channel, there are links down below. We have merchandise and gaming communities and a bunch of other things too, but I think the video is long enough already, no need to ramble any further. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.